How's that?
All right.
All right. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your schedule and all these great things in this wonderful book. It's called The Blues, the authentic narrative of my music and culture, Chris Thomas King.
That's right.
So, how long did this book take you to write, Chris?
Um, well, the short answer is it took at least 10 years. But of course, I wasn't writing every day. There was some starts and stops. When I started to write, when I started making notes and wanting to write, it was right around the time that my father's club was raised in 1999. But I didn't know exactly what I wanted to say or how I wanted to say it. But then, but I was thinking about it. But then, because I wanted to capture the memory of his business and what we did and the cultural impact that it had in Louisiana. And then after Katrina happened in New Orleans, and I lost my home in Katrina to the flood, and so many of us was dispersed from the city, and it was a threat, to the culture of Louisiana. I mean, what was left of the real memory um, was kind of fading. At least a lot of us felt. And so I knew then that, yeah, I needed to definitely write a book. But uh, I didn't really get started on the journey until in the ailing days of my dad. My dad had Alzheimer's, and I did a little project with the Louisiana State University to have a folk lorist go over and interview him on his good days, and they transcribed the interview. And I thought that once they transcribed the interviews with him, and I did some interviews or whatever, then I could just take that stuff, take those transcriptions, and that's a book. But it don't work that way. And so, being green about writing, I had no idea that you can't just take a speech or somebody spoke to an audience or spoke to an interviewer, and make that a book. And I tried hiring another writer to help me write it. That was frustrating because the writer was conventional in his wisdom about the blues. And me trying to explain how I wanted the book to proceed, I quickly realized that wasn't going to work out either. So I was going to have to write this thing myself. And I know it's a long answer, but uh, it did take 10 years. So it takes me about, 10 minutes to kind of give you some backstory. Now, and then once I started writing, and I was writing more of a memoir of my coming of age in my dad's juke joint, Tabby's Blues Box in Heritage Hall. But as I was going through that and trying to do research for the book, I realized that the blues did not have a history. And at that point, that was the marker where things took a different turn. And what a book that could have been written in about a year or two turned out to, I had to go and find out why, all the things that people had quoted was misquoted, or there were lies or whitewashing and things like that, and things just didn't add up. So I had a hunch on when I went on my journey. I had a hunch, but I was going to let the facts and the primary evidence guide me as to what the book would be in the end. So the research, the reading, the finding the original documents, the original printing of W.C. Handy's book, not that was printed in 1926, not the reprints, because they revise them and they take things out and add things in and kind of shape it for the marketplace as it progresses, along. But the original WC, for example, the original W.C. Handy anthology, which is the first blues anthology, which kind of starts us on this whole journey of blues, literature. Um, and that's what makes W.C. Handy for a long time, being called the father of the blues. In his blues anthology, you find songs by um, The guy that wrote Porgy and Bess. What's the composer? Now I just ran into a blank. But but uh, but symphonic blues stuff that was a Gershwin, George Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue.
Hmm.
A few of Gershwin's songs was in there, including Rhapsody in Blue. So what is Rhapsody in Blue and George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin and people like this doing in the first blues anthology? And in that blues anthology, there was not one song by a Delta singer, by a Mississippian or a musician from Mississippi or anything. It had no reference to Mississippi other than Spencer Williams, a songwriter from New Orleans who wrote a song called Mississippi Delta Blues. But I don't think he was talking about the Mississippi Delta we know. I think he was talking about New Orleans, which is the Mississippi Delta. So that's why it took so long, because I was on this journey and of research, and of course in between tours and traveling and things like that. But it was a 10-year journey, and it was an incredible journey for me.
And very well written and very well researched from what I could see in all the. I looked at the footnotes. There was lots of footnotes of places and people and things that you searched out, and all the facts are in the book, which it blew me away, some of the stuff that you had in that book. And what I want to start to do with the book is start with the prologue, which was you wrote about the last days of your dad's club, the juke
Yeah.
joint. And the first days, let's talk about the first days, since you talked about the last days. The first days, he worked a full-time job, and he decided that he was a musician just like you. Yeah. He was a full-time musician, well, a musician, and he had a day job, and he wanted to open a club. And finally, it took him till 1979 to open the club. He found a place and he opened the club. And you were there, that you were what, 16, 17 when the club opened.
Yeah, when we started hammering and nailing and trying to turn this old grocery store, it was a very old building from the early 1920s, uh, kind of a classic, Louisiana, New Orleans style building. And yeah, I was about 15, 16 when we started tearing it out and trying to turn it into a juke joint.
And the
Yeah.
first night, you had a big crowd the first night, and it was a great thing. Then the next day, the police came. I remember. I don't know if I read that correctly.
Yeah, we
And
were shut down.
that you guys shut down because you didn't have a liquor license.
That's right.
And your father and you guys decided to continue as without liquor for a while. That didn't work very well.
Yeah,
And
7 Up and Coca-Cola and bubble and bubble mint gum and pig lips only go so far.
yeah, I
Yeah.
remember the pig lips on the bar. You had
Yeah.
people would come in, and then it was called Tabby's Blues Box. And then they changed the name to Tabby's Blues Box and the Heritage Hall. There's a reason they had to do that. You want to tell the listening audience?
Yeah, well, on that opening night, there was a young lawyer that moonlighted. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer who moonlighted as a harmonica player. An Italian gentleman by the name of John DiGiulio, and John was there and offered my dad his services. Saying that it looked like he needed a lawyer. He needed some help. My dad said he couldn't afford a lawyer, but they made a little pact that if my dad could put up with his harmonica playing, that he can come in and get on stage and play with him. He'll try to get him set up, get his license back, and try to get him a proper liquor license and so on and so forth. So my dad's place was near a playground, like right the opposite corner. Just there was a playground there, and that playground now across the street from Tabby's is the old temple roof. I mean, was the temple theater on the rooftop of this 3 or 4 story building. That's where Ray Charles, BB King, James Brown, T-Bone Walker, all these Ike and Tina Turner, all these Chitlin Circuit uh, musicians would come and play this hall right across the street from where Tabby's opened. But that was before Tabby's. They that had long ceased after integration. So integration came around the 60s, early 70s. My dad opened his place in 79, and then 79, that once burgeoning, thoroughfare of black businesses and things, it had diminished greatly. So he was one of the only places open there. And next door to him was a soul food cafe called Rose and Thomas. But uh, what we were
We,
I
we were
lost my
talking about Heritage Hall, how it ended up getting the
yeah,
name.
yeah. So John went down to the license board downtown and argued with them and found a compromise, because they just felt that Tabby's was just a bar, just any old bar opened up. But John gave him a spiel, on the history and how it had cultural significance and things like that, and it was trying to perpetuate the Louisiana blues heritage. And so they made a little bit of a compromise and allowed him to get a liquor license, even though he was near a playground. And that really is what distinguished my dad's club. There was a lot of other bars and juke joints uh, around at that time, but that's kind of what gave my dad a unique position in the community as being a heritage hall, and it really uh, was a distinguishing factor that made a huge difference to the type of people that it attracted. Because soon after we got going, we started getting bus tours coming from France and other places, coming to visit us without any warning, really, until we could kind of figure out a way to tell people when they had large tours coming, they had to book a little early so we could be ready for them.
So yeah, in the prologue of the book, you talk about the last days, which he was there 20 years, 1999, correct?
That's, yeah, 20 years, and then another 5 years at a new location. Yeah.
Right. And then it actually closed after that. And you were talking about how that affected you, because that's your whole life basically was the blues box, living within the blues box, and your dad's dream of having a club like that.
Yeah, and now there's lots of clubs that feature blues music, but what made this place unique is this Creole cultural thing that he had going on there. My dad's big hit song that he had in his career was called the Hoodoo Party. 1961, he was on Excello Records. My dad was good friends with Slim Harpo, Lightning Slim, and so many other Louisiana musicians, Fats Domino, and all these people. But him and Slim was real tight, and Slim had, Scratch My Back and I'm a King Bee, some big hits, for Excello Records. And Slim got my dad a recording contract, with Excello, because my dad used to drive him to the sessions, and then, you know, my dad got his opportunity, and Hoodoo Party was a big hit for him. But that Creole culture and that Louisiana culture is really what I didn't understand it at the time when I was a young man or a teenager. But through writing my book, the wisdom of my dad and what his mission was, became very clear to me. He was most people think that the blues originated in the Mississippi Delta, in the state of Mississippi, in northern Mississippi, that place we call the Mississippi Delta. But my dad was going against the grain because he was connecting the blues with the New Orleans culture, the roots of the blues. And
Creole.
so, yeah, the hoodoo, the Creole, the voodoo isms, that's all mixed into the blues. That whole cultural thing is, and the way that we interacted, white and black in the 70s and early 80s. It was not. My dad's club was one of the first places in Baton Rouge that people congregated so freely. Slow dragging and hanging out all night, and the things that go on in these clubs. Everybody didn't like that. It was frowned upon by a lot of conservative members of the community. But that was that old time Louisiana spirit where, you had a lot of free black people and you had a lot of race mixing. You had, it was just a different society than the old rest of America, the British colonies and things. Louisiana has a very unique culture, and that was one of the difficult things to nail down in the book because it's so rich and it has so many layers. Um, and it's one thing to know the story. It's another thing, how do I articulate this to a person who doesn't know anything about it without them getting lost in a matrix of,
Well, I
you
got
know
lost. I can tell you, I got lost in a lot of what you wrote because there was so much detail in what you wrote in reference to Louisiana and Creole and going back to France and Spain and all the things that were going on way back. I mean, even further back than the 1900s, 1800s. You went back to the 1700s, even more. And before I get into that, because that's where the culture part of it, this book comes from. You detail all of your culture, the stuff before you, and I want to get into some of that because there's some interesting things I read in the book in reference to that. But I want to finish with Tabby's Blues Box. At one point in time, you helped your dad because they were in finance. They had some financial hard times, and you stepped up and helped him out. And then a few years later, I guess the city or the town wanted to. They had an overpass they wanted to put through right through your dad's club,
right through, right over the top of it.
and you explain. I mean, in the prologue, you explain how you felt about the last days there. It was your whole livelihood. Your life was in that club with your dad, and it was kind of heartwarming to hear you talk about it the way you talked about it in the beginning of the book
I
and
appreciate
throughout the
that.
book where when you talked about different parts of what happened with the blues box and your dad and things that were going on, like 2003 I read in the book was a tough year because your dad was sick, and that wasn't that the same year, or 2003 2004 I think was when they told him that they were going to bring an overpass over his club right around that time, somewhere in there.
Yeah, the timeline is it was in the '90s when the overpass came about, and
Approved, right? They approved they
yeah,
were going to do it.
yeah, and so the original club was raised. And then he moved on near the river in downtown Baton Rouge and opened another club there.
Right, the
But
second
that
club.
club, yeah, it wasn't as successful culturally anyway as the original club. The original club is where all the action took place and where my most of my memories were established. By the time he moved to the second club, well, I was out in Los Angeles doing, Old Brother Warthau, which we filmed in 1999. I was doing, I was on my journey, so I wasn't there on a daily basis like I had been as a youngster growing up there. So, and then a lot of the older blues musicians that played at Tabby's, Silas Hogan, Guitar Kelly, um, Clarence Edwards and Henry Gray, and so many others. Well, Henry Gray only passed away about a year or so ago. He lived to be in his late 90s. But most of the musicians, by the time he opened the second club, they were no longer, with us. And my dad was in his late 70s, at the time as well when he had a stroke. So that part of the culture that really kind of exploded out of the 1960s and 70s was kind of giving way. And it was not only just giving way, but it was giving way to, as far as blues being seen as a black cultural expression, it wasn't seen that way anymore. And a lot of black people didn't support the blues. And like, I'm saying that in past tense, not that anything has changed, but I'm just saying, and contemporaneously when these things were happening, black support wasn't there. Black people didn't attend these kind of clubs. They didn't go to these kind of places. They didn't go to the festivals. Young black people of my generation, like I said in my prologue, turned their back on the blues,
Yep.
after the 1960s. And I had to grapple with that. And this whole book is about me grappling with that. And so my dad's his second club, Tabby's Blue Box #2, it lasted up until about 2004,
Yep.
and it closed at that time. And we had a farewell party, and I speak about that in the book. And that was the end, of that of an era, really.
Yeah. For you, it was
Yeah,
a long era of your life. A good part of your life was involved in that part of your
that's right.
dad's music and his
That's right.
business. So let's get to culture. That's the next part of the book I want to talk about. And I could be here for hours and hours asking you questions about the book.
Yeah, and for the listener, the book is I broke it up into three different acts. Like we have the culture. Well, we have the prologue, which we talked about a bit. Why I wanted to write the book and freeze those memories and be able to share them with my son and with other generations to come. And the real authentic narrative of the blues. But yeah, it's broken up into culture, which is that triangle from France, Spain and France to Haiti and Louisiana and back again, that kind of triangle going on there with the culture
And
that
Africa
created
too.
this.
You mentioned Africa in there too.
Yeah, Africa is a part of it. I don't see it as part of it is, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not necessarily a triangle. I'm trying to draw a triangle, but it looks kind of weird now, that triangle. But yeah, Africa is a part of it. But the reason that I don't focus on Africa so much in the culture part, except for reference, some references, obviously that's where the enslaved people were being taken from. But I don't focus there as much as I focus on France and Louisiana and the Caribbean and Haiti, uh, because culturally, the meaning of Creole is that it's a African person born, you know, in a Spanish territory, and that is the definition of Creole, meaning that you're not seen as being the Africans that were enslaved and brought on a ship over to America, speaking their own language, their native language, and with their latest native spirituality. They were a lot more hard to be broken by the enslavers. So the enslavers had a tougher time with someone who came straight from Africa, you know,
Yep.
but someone who was born in Louisiana, born in a Spanish territory, they were labeled Creole, meaning that they were the owner would have a little boy. They would probably speak the French, some kind of form of the French language, which is a kind of broken Creole, broken French with a little African thrown in, and they would be a little bit more malleable, more manageable, or more adaptable. And so that's what Creole. A lot of people believe that Creole has something to do with, being mixed race, like you mix with Spanish or French. That has nothing to do with it. If you were French and you were born in a French colony, you know what that made you?
No.
It made you French. It
Yep.
made you French. Like an American born in, like my daughter was born in Denmark. I mean, I'm her dad. She's American. So it
Yep.
doesn't make her some kind of Creole, some other thing. But this was just a distinction to say that this African is a little more acclimated, to
Mhm.
this new world. That's really, it's not a compliment or anything. It's just a distinction. So when I'm trying to draw this triangle that built the Creole culture, Africa is definitely a part of it, but it's the Africanism that people were able to pass on, like your parents might pass on some spirituality, some voodoo spirituality, how some customs, some food, like gumbo was created and all kind of things that was like taking a little bit of Africa, a little bit of France, a little bit of this, a little bit of Spanish, and mixing it together, to survive, as kind of a Creole way of life. But what's most distinguishable about Louisiana, as opposed to the British colonies, and I go in depth about it, is manumission, being able to buy your freedom. You know, there was a lot of free black people in Louisiana in the 1700s and throughout slavery in the 1800s, and they were very prosperous. They owned cigar plants. They were business people. Some were even slave owners with large slave plantations. And I'm not, that's nothing to be proud of. You know, that's a terrible thing. But it's just an example of the kind of agency and the kind of wealth that the African people had. And then after Haiti um, fought off the French and won their freedom with the Haitian Revolution, a lot of Haitians came into Louisiana. And what they brought into Louisiana in around 1800 or so, they brought the red beans with them. They brought a love for opera. They had operas and stuff. The free Haitians in Haiti loved opera and things. And so they brought that passion for that. They built a theater in New Orleans, had a 100-piece black orchestra in that theater that they supported. And those musicians were able to have lessons and had leisure time to learn the violin and all these instruments. And so they had a thriving culture. And that's what so that's kind of the context
Well,
of the old Creoleness, African Creole people. That's the kind of, you
well,
know.
that's a great segue into what I'm going to ask you next. There was a freed Creole in your book in the 1700s that was a composer named Chevalier de Saint Georges. In the book, I was blown away when I read about him. I had no idea that he was um, influential on Mozart,
Hmm.
on Mozart writing music, and he had his own symphonies that he wrote that Mozart was learning from at the time. And I read that in the book, and I was like shaking my head. Wow, I had no idea who he was. My question to you about him is, where's his music today? We don't hear it.
Not in America. Um, Not in America, but there are some orchestras across Europe that keeps his music going. That performs some of his compositions. Um,
He was a freed Creole.
yeah, he was born a slave in Guatemala, and his mother was enslaved, and the slave owner, of course, raped his mother. But he was brought to France as a young man by his father. As when his father moved, a lot of times these aristocrats, well, they weren't aristocrats; they were poor people. Poor French people would go to make their fortune in the Caribbean, and after some years in the Caribbean, they hated being there, but that's where all the money was. And so they would make their fortune, and then they would go back and buy their way into polite society, become aristocrats, give money to the arts and all these kind of things to kind of make up for all the murdering and raping and chopping off people's arms and sugar plants and stuff. And so they would come in and people would, honor them or whatever. So his father decided at a certain point to move back to France. He had made enough money, and he brought St. George with him. And St. George grew up to be a fencer, a noted fencer, um, and and um, and he was France's leading musician, leading composer at the time that Mozart arrived in Paris, trying to make his name at the age of 21. Mozart came there he was 21 years old. St. George was 33. St. George had been uh, a great friend to Marie Antoinette. She had invited him to the palace to give her music lessons. And there's rumors of other things that went on with them. But I in my book, I don't go into those kind of personal things. You know what I mean? I try to
Hmm.
keep my focus, but I didn't go and try to validate or whatever. But him and the Queen, she really she would come to Paris to his art to see his performances and go skating with him, on the lake and things like this, on the ice when the lake would ice over. So he was but he couldn't marry because of the black code laws at the times. He never married. He couldn't marry, but he was quite a ladies' man. But Mozart came there a bit desperate, looking for an opportunity because he had been a child prodigy and he had performed for Queen Antoinette when he was a little boy, like, 10, 15 years prior. But by the time he became a young man, Mozart, the child prodigy, was a stale act. It had grown stale. But he hadn't grown up. He was still pretty a brat. He was a brat, petulant, and you know, probably, he didn't have a lot of nice things to say about many, many, many people. And he didn't, he so and I try to capture some of that in the book because they do battle. But St. George wins out in the end. To make that story short, St. George wins out in the end and maintains his stature, as the leading composer in France. But in Mozart's, and then Mozart and him ended up living in the same palace after Mozart's mother died in Paris, and he lived with St. George and others in one of these government, royal palaces. Mansions, and they lived there for about 6 months together, which means they had meals together, which means they congregated together. They probably went to the same events and salons and things like this. And we know for a fact that Mozart took some of this man's, St. George's, music note for note and wrote it into his compositions. And some people call it his French influence. But his biographers always say it's his Paris influence or his French influence instead of using the word St. George, and telling you who he was influenced by, like it was just some general influence. No, it was St. George that he was influenced by. And when you listen to St. George's music, you can find his music on Spotify. And if you listen to his music, you're going to think for a second, is that Mozart I'm listening to? Because they sound so similar. They have the same kind of bounce and the same kind of lightness, in certain spots. And it's not like every composer wrote in that style. Haydn and all these people, they didn't write in that style. That was something that that St. George had established, and that Mozart was influenced by and adapted. But like a lot of people in my book, St. George is somebody you didn't hear of in America on purpose, because anybody who tried to shine light on Black creativity, anybody who because it was in the United States government and the slave owners and the Jim Crow politicians and stuff, it was in their best interest to present Black people in America and Black people in Africa as savages and as primitive people, and as people who, we have them enslaved, but we're trying to teach them to be Christians. This is good for them. They're happy, as slaves. So they were always trying to dehumanize and trying to present Black people as not having souls, or women don't we can operate and experiment on these women because they don't feel pain like white women do, and all kinds of things, unspeakable acts that they did to Black people. And somebody like St. George exposes that type of insanity, that type of medieval, barbarianism that people perpetuated on Black people. He exposes that because other French people can relate to him, other English people can relate to him and say, wow, he's wonderful. And the last little thing I'll say about that chapter is our second president, John Adams, was in France and wrote about his experience in his journal. He wrote about St. George, and he said he was the best fencer, the best dancer, and the best musician in all of France, he said all of Europe. And that's I quote that in the book from John Adams. But then John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and people like that they would know about St. George, and they would know a lot of these things that I exposed in my book. But then they would come back to America and pretend that they didn't know these things, that Black people really didn't have the capacity to make high art, or they didn't have this kind of creativity. And this is something that people even today, continue to try to perpetuate, because they don't even want you to talk about the past in schools or tell kids, what the truth or what really happened. So St. George, in other words, he's a very important figure, and I think my book would without him being in my book, before you get to Charlie Patton and stuff like that, you might think that the blues began with Charlie, like black musical culture began with Charlie Patton, or some slave who had a stick, and he took some twine and tied it to one end of the stick and to the other end of the stick, and made a sound. And then the slave heard that sound, and then that was the beginning of black music. That's the roots of black music. And nothing could be further from the truth. And that's why it's important to have St. George, great classical composer from the late 1700s, from the French Revolutionary period, in the book. And he influenced a lot of New Orleans musicians who went back and forth to France and New Orleans, who played in orchestras and wrote operas and stuff, all through slavery, including Edmond Dede and others.
You talked about free blacks in New Orleans back in the early 1800s, middle 1800s, and there's one section in your book where you say 1860 there were free blacks all over New Orleans. That's 5 years before emancipation. There were free blacks, and I didn't realize that until I read it in the book. The next phase of your book, I'm going to go into the actual music part, where you talk about the first blues pianist by the name of Mamie Desdunis.
That's right.
And the person that mentions her in your book, you mention it, is Jelly Roll Morton was the person that knew about her and was influenced by her. She was the first. And what year I don't remember what year she was. She was around the 1800s, correct? The middle 1800s, late 1800s.
Well, but Jelly Roll was born somewhere between 1885 and 1890. So so when he said that he was a little boy living with his godmother, who was a voodoo priestess. She practiced voodoo, and she lived. Jelly Roll said, in the Garden District, and he said near her, he would hear this woman on the piano, Mamie Desdunes. Now, Mamie Desdunes, a lot of blues people would know her famous song called 219 Blues. And, Janis Joplin and all kinds of people have recorded 219 Blues. Sometimes it comes in under other names, but the root name of the song is 219 Blues. And he would hear her sing this tune, and he said that was the first blues that he remembered hearing. And that meant that had to be sometime in the 1890s that he was, in the early 1890s, probably, when he was maybe, I'm thinking, like 8, 9, 10 years old. And Jelly Roll was playing guitar at that time. His godmother had bought him a guitar, and he was trying to learn the guitar. But he would hear her on the piano, and at some point, he ended up, starting to play piano himself. But a lot of the free black people would have musical instruments in the home. I mean, just any old, poor person, white or black, would not have a piano in their home at this time. That was kind of a status thing, really. And so for her to be playing a piano, and for him to, have a piano in his home, which his parents ended up kicking him out of the house at a certain point for playing these barrel house, blue songs. But Mamie Desdunes, just to let people know a little bit more about her story, she is part of what I call the first family of blues. Now this stuff about W.C. Handy. We know that this stuff was a bit, an aggrandizing tale that W.C. Handy and a lot of white primitivists and people that wanted a certain representation of black art and music kind of held him up, and he kind of played into their primitive fantasies of what black people were, and created this false idea, this false backstory that blues was somehow connected with slavery, which it is not. And so Mamie Desdunes' father is very important in American culture, Louisiana culture, in the struggle for civil rights, because her father's name was Rudolph Desdunes. And Rudolph Desdoon was a poet and a writer. He wrote for uh, a newspaper that was about liberty for Black people. And he had a son whose name was Dan Desdunes, who played in one of these early orchestras that became the Eagle Band and all these bands that King Oliver ended up, taking over and stuff. But his son, way back in the early 1990s, played in this band. And so it was a whole musical and creative family. And Rudolph Desdunes is important because most people have heard of Duplessis versus Ferguson, the case where the New Orleanians created a committee to fight uh, Jim Crow laws, where they was starting to make Black people, because in New Orleans, Black and white people had always been right up together. They always had been living together, and in the 1890s, they began to want to separate the races. And so, Black people couldn't ride on the streetcar and on the train and sit in certain sections. And they formed a committee to fight these Jim Crow separate but equal laws. And they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it took about 4 years to get to the Supreme Court, the case. But he used his son as the person who was go ride on the bus, buy a ticket, and sit in the white section, and then be arrested. Then we bail you out, and then we'll have a case. But his son Dan Desdunes, the musician, he did it first, and then then he found out he had to be on he wasn't on the right railway. They needed to be on a rail in order to take it to the Supreme Court. It needed to be on one of these.
Federal.
On a kind of a federal train, that would go into federal court. And so they did it again. The second time they did it with a neighbor that they knew named Plessy. And so Plessy versus Ferguson ended up going to the Supreme Court. And while that was going to the Supreme Court, Mamie Desdunes, Rudolph Desdunes, the poet and writer and activist, and his son Dan, in the early version of the Eagle Band, I think they call it the Olympic Band that he was in. Everybody didn't want to play Anglo-Saxon music. They didn't want to abide by Anglo-Saxon Protestant mores, and so they started pushing back against it. In other words, if we do it, we're going to do it our way. We're going to creolize it, And so they started taking the music and kind of using their poetry, music, and any other kind of way they could to protest, the annexation of their culture, their way of life, that they had lived this way for, a couple hundred years. I mean, the drums were never banned in New Orleans. Congo Square, dating back to the 1700s, early 1800s, Black people had always had, free expression, but a lot of their way of life was being annexed and being taken from them. And that was the birth of the blues. And the Anglo-Saxon Protestants, their pushback was that what these people were doing was the devil's music, because people don't, it don't, you kind of got to take yourself back there to realize that people really identified with what religion they were back then. Whether you were Catholic or Protestant, it meant something.
Mm-hmm.
It meant more sometimes than the color of your skin. The pushback, the tug of war between Anglo-Saxon Protestantism and Creole Catholic culture that took place for ever since the Louisiana became a state, and ever since Americans kind of came into Louisiana and tried to Americanize Louisiana, make everybody start speaking English, tell Black and white people, some people had families that were mixed race, and then that family had to kind of split up because, you couldn't be congregating together. And so they made all of these laws. And then the other thing that the Anglo-Saxons did was the blue laws. And that's really important to the blues. Blue laws are like moral laws where you can't buy. There's places around the country now.
They still have them.
Yes.
They still have them.
Yes. And so blue laws are where you can't buy alcohol on a Sunday. You're not supposed to do gaming, gambling, go to balls and, juke joints and parties and horse racing and all these moral codes that they tried to impose on Louisiana culture. But that's what we, I mean, that's what we do. I mean, on
Yep.
Sundays, that's when the people went to Congo Square and played their, you know, that was a tradition here. So that clash, those blue laws, and is kind of like that's the real defin. This is a good time to give the audience the 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 proper definition of when you say the blues, the original definition. And the original definition has to do with those blue laws. It has to do with the Anglo-Saxon Protestants pushing back against the Creole culture, and the fact that everybody spoke French. French was the popular language. The black newspapers was written in French. Mamie Desdundes' father wrote in French. He wrote one of the first histories of the Creole people, but it's written in French. It was translated later to English. Jelly Roll Martin's parents spoke French. So that was the first language of Black people in Louisiana, especially the ones who were there at the time before the Americans came. And the word blues, when it comes to music and entertainment in the French language, it means sacre bleu, or holy shit, you know, or sacre deal, which is like cursing God or something that people hold sacred. So when they would say, well, we don't allow the blues in this establishment, this is a proper establishment, we don't do that here or whatever, what they're saying is that, we're upstanding moral type of thing. And blue laws is like blue. We've heard of blue comics like Lenny Bruce, or a blue comic like Richard Pryor, or Red Fox, or Dave Chappelle. You know, you could call him a blue comic. You know, they use language that's curse words, and they talk about certain kind of subjects and things that are really outrageous and shocking, and have you saying, holy shit, you know, did he really say that? But they're doing that to enlighten you. And just because somebody is speaking some filthy words or making some filthy jokes or a filthy song doesn't make it necessarily art. You know, anybody can do that. But what made Richard Pryor a great artist, what makes Dave Chappelle a great artist, you know, what made Ray Charles a great artist when people were saying he was doing the devil's music, is the fact that he's bringing light. You know, he's saying that I'm not going to let the church is not going to, and the priest is not going to control every aspect of my life. You know, I have freedom of expression. And so through my art and through my music, through my paintings, you know, I'm going to express that. And then a lot of people lower in society are usually raised up by that because it gives them voice, you know, and they can relate to it. And so the blues was an enlightening freedom of expression that the Black Creoles, is the way they expressed the frustration that they had with their culture being taken away from them in their way of life in the 1890s. And that's when they started doing a sacred Christian song, like When the Saints Go Marching In. And they take it, and Buddy Bolden or somebody might take a song like that, an old Christian hymn, and take that song and make it a bawdy Saturday night anthem where people are drinking and women are getting loose and stuff. And then people say that's the devil's music. But, you know, but that is what the state would say about any revolutionary, you know. That's what the state would say about, you know, any great artist who is trying to enlighten people and shine a light on the, you know, trying to enlighten people, trying to get people to snap out of superstitions about each other, you know, trying to snap out of superstitions and be enlightened and be more accepting of the differences that we have, and to just express your own humanity. So that's what, the blues in New Orleans, when Jelly Roll Martin had the Jelly Roll Blues, and you had Louis Armstrong doing China Blues with King Oliver, and you had West End Blues and Basin Street Blues and 219 Blues by Mamie Desdundes, and they had 1,000 songs called the such and such a blues. They would call themselves the Creole Band and this and that. It was music of revolution, of freedom of expression. Now, when it left Louisiana, and then in Louisiana, you also had a lot of freedom. You had Storyville, you had a red light district in New Orleans where prostitution and all kinds of stuff was, people were pretty tolerant down here. Uh, and then that closed down in 1917, and a lot of the musicians ended up in Chicago working for people like Al Capone and and a lot of gangsters, who was because you had prohibition going on, which I didn't talk a lot about in the book because it would have been a 600-page book. But prohibition sent a lot of the free thinking people underground. And so they had speakeasies where you kind of had to have a secret password to get into the club. And this is the first time that women are starting to come out, into clubs and mingle and drink whiskey and stuff like that, because before that they weren't really allowed in saloons. But there was a prohibition on alcohol, and New Orleans musicians was invited to Chicago as the entertainment to keep the party going, so to speak. And the word blues, even though this music was about Saturday night, it was bawdy music, it was subversive music. It ended up the popular the powers that be, the white establishment, saw this music as a threat because white kids liked it. White musicians was drawn to it, which white and black musicians wasn't supposed to be performing together. White kids were going to Harlem, to, slumming and things like this, and going to the black clubs and dating black people and all this stuff here. And so the powers that be could not have this go on. It was a threat to the whole social system they was trying to set up with Jim Crow. And so the word blues became a pejorative, meaning that we're not going to let you in our theater, or in our fancy ballroom to play the blues. So they had to start calling it something else. Jazz, swing, any old kind of name would do. But the blues is kind of like gangster rap or something. We don't hear people, there are no gangster rappers anymore. I don't know if you probably don't listen to rap, but there are no gangster rappers. Not that, but what was gangster rap? They were rapping about, selling drugs, misogyny, all kind of violence and all this kind of stuff here. And they still rapping about it. They just don't call it gangster rap. they might call it trap music or whatever, but
it's all the same. It's the same.
Yeah, so the poetry of the blues didn't really change but you couldn't call it that and sell it commercially, and then white people wouldn't buy the record and bring it into their home, if it was so subversive. But that's what allowed some of the white musicians to record it in the 1920s, or the Dixieland Jazz Band to record the blues and make it into the white homes, because white people would go to the theater and see white performers perform in blackface. They might even go see black people perform. But this technology of recording was very new in the 20s, and to bring a record home and play it in your home was kind of sacred. So to bring black music and black people into your home and play it for your family, that
wasn't going to happen.
Yeah,
that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, so they didn't record black people initially doing this music. They recorded white people, and then they told the white people to take off the blackface so there's no mistake. We know that you're good, clean, white boys and girls. So the blues got lost in translation, and it became anglicized and started being called. Instead of being this revolutionary music that burst out of New Orleans and inspired black people to stop wearing blackface, because before the blues, to get on a stage in New York, you had to wear blackface.
Hey.
And the blues ended that. The blues had black people, to stiffen their spine, and not, yeah. And so the blues kind of changed that, and the pushback was the establishment didn't want the blues to become America's music, or didn't want these people to be heroes. And they ended up taking the blues and merging it with a whole different type of music, which is slave music. And they created this whole false background to kind of merge these two. And that's what W.C. Handy helped them to do. And to make it like the blues was the work songs and the songs that the slaves sung and all that. And last I checked, Jelly Roll was never a slave, never picked any cotton. Louis Armstrong never picked any cotton. Um,
King Oliver never picked any.
King Oliver never. The only cotton they might have wore is cotton suits or whatever. So they were bohemian. They were poor people. They were poor. They were bohemians. City dwellers, but they hadn't picked cotton. And so the whole new, and it's still true today, to be a genuine blues man or woman, you got to give the reporter or the interviewer a story about, you picked cotton back in the day, and I took a piece of twine and I tied that to a pole and I tied it to another pole. And that's the story they want to hear, because it perpetuates the fact that Black people are somehow less than human or just coming into civilization, and they should be lucky that they were enslaved, in America, so that they could, learn how to be civilized, from their enslavers. And this is the main point that every page of my book fights. It's about humanizing not only my story and humanizing me and my father and my family and my culture, uh, but humanizing, the Black diaspora as a whole. Every page of my book is about that.
So let's talk about you being a revolutionary. Back in the 90s, the early 90s, you released an album called 21st Century Blues from the Hood. And it was, according to the book, I didn't know this either. It was because of the Rodney King riots. You wrote the album, and you took a lot of abuse from you call them the blues mafia for putting out a record like that. And let me explain to the listening audience, that record is revolutionary because it was the first time that someone melded blues and funk and rap and hip hop and everything all in one on one record. And it's like a, what's the word for it? What do they call those records? I can't think of the name of it, but it's exactly your whole book in a record, basically, is what it is. And it's a concept album, basically, is what they call it today. And I was like blown away when I heard it back in '94 when it came out. You most of it you write in the book. You talk about all the things that went on, and I'm going to mention one of them. You played it in your dad's club one night, some of the songs from it, and some of the people liked it. The younger people probably liked it, and the older people weren't too happy with it. And your dad wasn't happy either. So tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, that was I think that was the lowest point. That was the lowest point. Yeah, I remember it vividly. That was the lowest point in my journey, and I can't really say it's probably the lowest point ever. In my whole journey, not just up to that point, because I had just gotten this huge record deal with Warner Brothers Records. And man, I was gonna, my dreams, of traveling the world and playing my guitar and playing the blues and drawing large audiences. And I had this big corporation behind me. And man, I was going to do great things, and lo and behold, because of the type of music that I wanted to make, after I made my first couple of albums, which were, my first album came out with our Hooli. It was very traditional. For those who don't know, my career began, I was quote unquote discovered by folklorists. So I was the last of the 20th century blues musicians to be discovered by folklorists and brought to the attention of the music, world. I mean, that began with people like Leadbelly and Muddy Waters, people like that, where folklorists go out and quote unquote discover you. And next thing you know, you're making a record and you're seen as some kind of cultural, primitive, whatever. I didn't know all this at the things I'm saying to you today. I had no idea of these things back then. But anyway, that's how my real career had started. And I'd made my first album that came out for a major label, Cry to Profits. And that had done really well. And I'd done the Dave Letterman show, and I, was on my way. We were selling records, making videos. And then the Rodney King thing happened. And it wasn't just because of Rodney King, but my music, whole thing was that I wanted my blues to be true to my generation, true to my voice, Uh, and I felt that was important to me, because otherwise I would feel like I was acting, playing a role, or giving, let me find out what your fantasies are about me, and let me try to live up to those fantasies. And usually those fantasies was some kind of primitivism, fantasy that I was supposed to live up to. But and I had got on the bad side of a lot of these purists and these folk purists and blues mafia types, because I had began to use Pro Tools and digital recording and sampling, to make my blues. And they were fighting me on that. Just the fact that there's a drum machine on the record was blasphemous, It was the equivalent of Bob Dylan playing the electric guitar at Newport in the 60s, they just went out of their minds, like the world was ending, because I was, embracing, technology. I was modernism was something that the blues was not supposed to be. The blues was supposed to accentuate some primitive, utopia that that white people fantasized about, and I was breaking with that, and but not playing. I was challenging those fantasies. And when I came out with 21st Century Blues from the Hood, well, Warner Brothers wouldn't release it, because at that time there was a lot of controversy about gangster rap and about Cop Killer. Body Count's album Cop Killer had come out before my rap album, which my rap album was supposed to come out about 2 months afterward. And the nation was just in an uproar about this music, and they shut it down. And so I had a long-term contract with Warner, a 7-year deal, and I had a few albums guaranteed. And so my second album was a guarantee to me, so they couldn't cut me, but they didn't know what to do with me, so they kind of shelved my music. And so I found myself back at my dad's club, like you say, and I was not in a good mood, and I felt that nobody in my family really understood, well, just do, what's the problem? Just because when they go to work, when my dad go to when we used to go to his plant job, or my mom go to the laundry and work at the laundromat, you just, when the boss tell you go over there and do such and such, you just go do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Most people just follow orders at their job, so they couldn't understand, these people are paying you all this money. Why can't you just play the music, give them what they want? And I didn't have a good answer for that. And by me not having a good answer, it created a kind of madness, and I was unsure about myself, what's wrong with me? Maybe there's something wrong with me, that I can't just, because I can play the guitar, I can sing whatever songs they want me to sing, but I had to do a certain kind of thing my way.
And you didn't want to do that. You wanted to do your thing.
Yeah, and it wasn't just my thing necessarily. And I don't want to sound too, I don't want to come off wrong here, but I didn't want to turn my back on those blues men and women who I played with coming up as a kid, and they all believed in me. They said, man, you could take this places we never could, I didn't want to turn my back on my culture. And yeah, I might have a luck up and have a hit top 40 song or two, and then I'm forgotten about, like a lot of people, one hit wonder, and I got to go back into my community. I got to live out the rest of my life, and I didn't want it to go that way. So I wanted to do something that was true to not only me personally, but true to my culture. But I couldn't articulate it like I'm articulating it with you today. But at the time, I could only articulate it through music, through my guitar, through some poetry or a song I was writing. And so it all kind of, I ended up having to leave America. My dad, the kind of music I was playing at the blues bars was not gonna put food on the table. As you say, I was playing this music there, and it wasn't going over well. You don't sell a lot of beer, doing this type of thing. You got to get the people what they want. So I ended up leaving the country and going to Europe. I was in exile, and I wasn't planning on coming back to America because a lot of blues festivals had banished me. A lot of people that was booking me decided they weren't going to book me anymore, or they had pushback against me, or they wanted to. But when I look back on it, they did this to Jelly Roll Martin. They would used to say that Jelly Roll Martin was some kind of egocentric, full of himself, saying that he invented jazz or something. You've heard these kinds of things that when Jelly Roll Martin's name come up, but Jelly Roll Martin was telling the truth when he did the Library of Congress interview in 1938, which I have many quotes from throughout the book. He told people then that W.C. Handy stole his music and that W.C. Handy was a fraud. And he said, I invented the blues, not W.C. Handy. Now they started calling that jazz, like they're talking about two different kinds of music. But Jelly Roll Martin told the whole story. But Alan Lomax buried that story. He did put out a book, but in the early 50s, but the Library of Congress recordings didn't come out until after Alan Lomax passed away. And they came out up in 2003, and they won a Grammy a posthumous Grammy for Jelly Roll Martin. And Jelly Roll Martin was vindicated once people actually heard his story, from his own voice. And I encourage anybody who want to get well, first of all, I encourage you to get my audio book, if you want to hear, my book, or, buy my book from Amazon or my website, which I do autographs. If you buy it from my website, I'll autograph it for you. But I encourage people to go to Spotify, or go wherever they can, and listen to Jelly Roll Martin over several days. I think it's 9 hours of audio. Listen to that, because that's the oral history. That's the real oral history of the blues. And it was buried. And so that means that a lot of people knew better. Now, I didn't know all of this back in the 90s when I was doing 21st Century Blues from the Hood and putting rap and all that with it. If I didn't, I was kind of naive in a way. I thought I could probably get away with it. I thought that I could get a corporation to bag me doing this. I don't know what made me think that. But anyway, I ended up.
Well, you did have someone that was helping you out, Isaac
I ended,
Tigran.
yes, I ended up in Europe in exile, and I ended up there for a couple of years, living in Copenhagen. I started a family in Copenhagen. And while I was in Copenhagen, I got together with some musicians and created the tapes of 21st Century Blues. And long story short, that ended up catching on back in America. John Porter, producer who had produced a lot of great albums at that time, he produced Buddy Guy's "Damn Right I Got the Blues" album, and that was a huge success. And he made he heard the tapes and decided, man, you got to get back to Los Angeles from Europe, and there's a deal waiting for you here with the House of Blues. And I had never heard of House, so I didn't know what the House of Blues was. But that was Isaac Tigran, was the guy who started the Hard Rock Cafe. He sold that business and then opened up a new business called the House of Blues, where he wanted to uplift the blues musicians and present the blues in a more modern, 21st century type of way. And he was bagging me through a record company that House of Blues has set up at RCA Records in private music. And I had some power behind me, I thought. But like I say in the book, at the end of the day, the cultural brokers who broker in Negro primitivism, I call them the blues mafia, they caused a stink, and Disney was behind the House of Blues, and Disney forced Isaac Tigran out of the House of Blues, which caused a whole trickle effect where I lost my deal with RCA and House of Blues label, and the support that I had for touring and all kind of stuff like that, it all kind of dried up. And the House of Blues went in a different direction where they weren't going to feature blues artists and things like that, and they just started being a general club. And I think now they've lost their cachet. Um, but yeah, even on the highest levels, when I was with the Warner Brothers Records, when I had the House of Blues and that whole corporation and Disney behind me, still uh, the blues mafia and the whole narrative about black people shouldn't be doing this kind of music, or this is not representative of, these are white folks who are deciding what black culture is. That's the other crazy thing about it. They're kind of teaching you how to be black, and it's like I did that didn't sit well with me. But anyway, 21st Century Blues is your favorite album, you told me.
Yeah, it
And
is.
I think some people got it. I toured Europe, I toured France. France embraced me. I was embraced in Paris and became quite popular in France, and became quite popular in certain places in Europe, Scandinavia and other places. But in America, it never did catch hold.
Then, a little bit later on, you ended up being an actor in movies. You're in two movies, two big movies actually. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, and the Ray Charles biopic Ray.
Mhm.
You were Tommy Johnson and turn of the century blues singer, and in Ray you were Lowell Folsom. How did those two things come about for you?
Well, Brother came about just by chance. The Coen brothers, I think the casting director, the story that I understand is the casting director was trying to find, they needed an actor who could also play the blues. Of course, you got people who can really play it, but they were older, people like Taj Mahal or Buddy Guy, whomever. But they needed somebody in my age range, in my generation, who could play it and also be an actor. So they were having some trouble casting the role for this Tommy Johnson character, based on Tommy Johnson, not Robert Johnson, but kind of Robert, kind of, they were playing with these kinds of legends and myths. But yeah, I got the script. I think she heard me on NPR. I was doing an interview on NPR or something, and then she decided to reach out to me. I was one of the few people that her name was Ellen Chenoweth. I was one of the few people that she um, sought out for the role, and I did a screen test. I had to do a screen test for it, and send some videos back and forth, and eventually they flew me out to Nashville where they were doing some sessions, and I met T-Bone Burnett there, and he was
Musical
the
director.
the music director and producer. And I had learned to play the Skip James song playing slide guitar. That's how I had prepared it for the audition. I had passed the screen test, but now it was time to go and play it for the directors in person. And I played it slide, but then he came in and T-Bone said, he wanted it to be more in the tradition of the original song, because I had tried to make it my own thing, but they were like, no, we have to stay
Stay
in this
within the.
period.
Yep.
Yeah. And don't break the spell for the audience. You want it to be as true to the period as you can. So I ended up getting a role, and a guitar player from Canada by the name of Colin Linden. I went back to Nashville and took some guitar lessons from him. He taught me how to do the fingering and stuff because he had it down. The whole Skip James, fingering thing, which I was more of an electric guitar guy with dreadlocks, kind of wailing, doing my Hendrixy stuff. That's what I had been doing all through the 90s. And so, but most people see me now today as an acoustic guitar player, you know, but they don't know those days when I was, when I was doing my wild thing, and so he and I, I got comfortable with, the way he was doing it, but then I ended up finding a comfortable way to perform that song. And that song is a very difficult song to perform, man, because it's one thing to play it the way Skip James played it and the kind of tuning that he used, which is a very strange tuning, but then to sing it and play it,
It's
That
not
was,
easy.
yeah, but what had prepared me for that was rapping and playing the guitar. I have been rapping and playing guitar, rhythm and lead and rapping. That is not the easiest thing to do either. It's like walking in two different directions at the same
Hmm.
time. So that had prepared me a little bit, even though that's very different music, it had prepared me to kind of have my voice doing one thing and my other side of my brain with my guitar doing something completely different. But yeah, I think most people know the rest of that story. I mean, that turned out to be a phenomenal success.
You got a Grammy, I saw, and you got a Country Music Award too.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, album of the year, country music, and bluegrass awards. I think I have every kind of award except any blues awards. I got Grammy. There was another Grammy for that for John Law Burn the Liquor Store Down from the Mountain. Uh, and then the Ray soundtrack won a bunch of Grammys, but it wasn't original music, so you don't get the chance to go for the Oscar. But because these were all songs that had been previously recorded in the movie Ray, and in the movie Oh Brother Where Art Thou, these were songs from a certain period of time. They weren't. You have to have an original song to be nominated for an Oscar.
So I played a bunch of songs before the interview. I played a Jelly Roll Blues. I played a Lonnie Johnson tune when he was playing live in Europe back in
Wow.
'63.
Okay.
And I played John Law Burn the Liquor Store. And I played, if I can remember, I have it right here. Blues from the Hood, from 21st Century Blues from
Okay.
the Hood.
Yeah.
And I played the song that Louis Armstrong made famous that you had on your album Rise, St. James Infirmary.
That's a good
And you
one.
actually played that the last time I saw you at Chan's a few years ago. Great
Yes.
version of it.
Thanks.
So, and I played the two new songs that you've released this year,
Yeah. Slow
which,
Dragon Blues, and the other one is Hard Times and Knocking. Yeah.
right. What do we have in store for you for new music coming up this year or in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, I have a new album that I've had ready. I had a new album that I was working on before I did Angola. That Angola was inspired kind of just off the cuff from watching social media about George Floyd. And I don't watch television, but I was seeing things on people were showing the protests and showing the things that were happening on their phones, and you could follow it on social media. And it inspired me, and I decided to record some of those chants. George Floyd, say his name, George Floyd. And I just decided that just rung with me, and I decided to sample that and kind of make an album. The album happened really quickly, but the George Floyd Angola album happened pretty quickly. But I was working on an album that I'm still working on that I was preparing to release at that time, but I put it aside and released that. And I'm just about finished with it. But, you know, when you have like 25, 30 songs, you got to start trying to figure out, okay, well, which ones are going to come out as a group, as an album. And so that's kind of the stage that I'm at now, just trying to decide how to release it. But then again, man, we're in a whole different era, John. It's like, you're trying to figure out how to release music. I mean, at your radio station, it seems you play stuff now directly from Spotify or something,
No, I play CDs.
but my new singles are not on CD.
I know. I MP3. I have to download them. It's a pain in my ass to do that, but
You hate doing it, but you do
that's
that
what I
if you
have
really
to. I
want to
have
play
to
it.
do it to promote your music. That's what I have to do.
Well, I do definitely appreciate you going through that extra trouble, and believe me, I do appreciate it. But I'm trying to figure out how to best get my music to you because,
I want
you
to
know,
hold it in my hand and play it. How's that?
yeah. But I mean, to make
Just like I can hold this book.
yes, I get you. But to make an album just for radio stations or to make a CD or a
It costs
vinyl
money.
album,
It costs
you know,
money. I know.
yeah, because the audience out there, when I'm traveling on a plane, you never see anybody with a CD.
Yep.
Nobody's going around with a CD player or Walkman. They don't even put them in cars anymore.
I know.
So the physical music that you can hold in your hand, it's it's so how
It's
and then
going away, like you said.
yeah,
It's slowly but surely going away.
and then what is an album? You know,
Well,
so
if you go back to when you were a kid and I was a kid, it was real important because you get to listen to an artist's entire album and not just one track at a time here and there. You get to hear the whole gamut. Well, I'll give you a great example: 21st Century Blues from the Hood. Do I want to hear that in single songs? No, I want to hear it all the way, the whole thing, including the bonus track, which you still haven't told me why you added that track.
yeah, some things I know it seems like since I wrote a book and I can, talk about the book that I have an answer for everything. And man, I just don't have an answer for
Well,
everything.
I can tell you
Some
why
things I
that
don't
song.
know
I can
why.
tell you why
I
that
don't know.
song is on there. I know why.
Yeah.
Because you were talking about yourself. Young Blues Rebel, I think, is the name of that song. It's the hidden track on the end. You were talking about yourself.
Something I just remember now. See, you just triggered a memory. That's the name of my publishing company, Young Blues Rebel. So I mean, I hadn't even put the two together in a long that yeah.
See
I,
that?
because I don't go back and listen. Like I said, when I talked to you the other day, I was like, when we did a little brief conversation, I was like, to kind of make sure that our technology was working. I said I'm going to go back and listen, and one day I think I'm going to go back and listen. But I'm always wanting to go forward, and so I don't really go back and listen to my earlier music, and that's kind of why I've never, even though I've done, you know, 15 albums or something, I don't know how many, but I've never done a best of or some kind of uh, historical album, the essential cuts of Chris Thomas King. I mean, I've never done anything like that. I just try to keep going forward, but maybe I need to kind of go back. Maybe it's good for fans to go back sometimes and reassess, what you did and kind of represent it, because sometimes you have a new audience or a new generation coming up, and they're hearing this stuff for the first time. Some people, so
Well,
maybe it's
I
time to look
laughed
back.
when I heard that song because that's what you were back then, the young blues rebel.
Oh yeah, I gave him hell.
Yeah, you
I gave
did.
him hell, man.
So how do people find out? You have a website, christhomasking.com, right?
Yeah, that's it. ChrisThomasKing.com. And as far as my social media handle, Chris Thomas King for YouTube and for Instagram. But I'm new to YouTube and Instagram. I'm just starting to get serious about it because I realize that as much as I don't like social media, as far as posting things and stuff, I like it for kind of just looking at what other people are doing. But for posting things about what I'm doing, I realize that's just the way things are now. So uh, people will be seeing more of me there. And this is what my thinking is at the moment about my new release. I know you say you're not crazy about having singles released, but I think I will release these as a single, at least a good dozen songs as a single before the album comes out. And when I think about that, that's not that different from the Beatles and people in their early careers. I mean, they would release a bunch of singles, and then
45s. They were
yeah, and then
releasing 45s. Yeah.
and then the album will come much later.
Yep.
So instead of putting out, because that way I can interact with my fans and I can interact with people and get, because I have it builds up here. It builds up when I'm writing and recording, and you end up with a whole bunch of material that it might take years to get out if you only put 10 songs on an album.
Yep.
So, you know, getting stuff out there a lot sooner, releasing a new single every few weeks or a month or something like that, is probably what you're going to see from me, and then the album,
Well,
you know.
okay.
But
So
yes, I definitely will have an album out before the end of the year.
when are you coming to the area so I can get you to sign all these things I have?
I don't know. I'm looking forward to getting back on the road, but I don't have any tour dates. The only tour date I have, I know I'm going to be playing New Orleans Jazz Festival. This October, they're having an October Jazz Festival.
No Blues Alley like you do every year in DC?
I don't think Blues Alley is there anymore. I
Oh, it's
think
gone.
Yeah,
Didn't know that.
a lot of venues didn't make it. You know, I think they had this issue with their landlord. I mean, they're right there in the middle of Georgetown. I know it's very expensive to be there. I love that place, man. I just love playing at you know, we used to go up there and do a whole week, you know, 8 shows in a row and twice a year. So I had really that was my, you know, that was kind of my new blues box, so to speak. You know what I
Yep.
mean? I had really gotten comfortable. But I hope they open a new place and you know can keep going. But in the meantime, I think you know people will be able to. Like I said, I'm going to try to release as much music as I can. Things that even don't go on the album, I'm going to try to release B-sides or you know try to get more music out there sooner to people instead of waiting a year or two to release 10 songs.
Well,
But
I know Chan's is still open.
Chance, yeah, that's great. And as far as getting back on the road with my band, I just don't know when that's going to happen. You know,
Same guys, Danny and Jeff.
that I don't know. I mean, that's we haven't, you know what I'm saying? I haven't been in a room with musicians in over a year, you know, and I record all my music kind of by myself. So on these new recordings, so I don't know what's going to happen. Um, I might come out with I was thinking about getting some background singers, man, and coming out with a, you know, a more of a kind of an R&B type of vibe, but do a bigger band thing when it's getting more harder on the road. It's just
It's hard.
yeah, but I have been playing for years as a trio. I love playing as a power trio, and because it gives me freedom to just kind of improvise and go wherever I want to go, and I don't have to stick to a fixed arrangement like the if you had horns or another keyboard player, you got to stick to the. But right now, a lot of I'm just talking out of my head, you know, just off the top of my head with you, which I don't normally do. So you got me feeling pretty comfortable.
Good.
but so I'm sharing some things. I don't know what's going to come to fruition, but what I'm certain of is that I'm supposed to be in Chicago to do to talk about my book and to do some book signings. So if I might see you sooner doing a book signing than I will,
Well,
you know, with my
keep
full
me
band.
posted if you come up to Massachusetts and do a book signing because I'll come see you.
Thank you. I'll let you know.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you. I got to get back because I got to throw Angola on before I close the show.
That's right. Well, I appreciate you giving me the spins and giving me this opportunity to share my book with everyone out there. And again, the book is, you know, the blues, the authentic narrative of my music and culture. And you can underline the word authentic.
All right. Thank you again. I really appreciate you taking all this time.
Thanks, man. It's nice to be on the Blues Deluxe show. Thank you.
Nice to have you always. Thanks
All
again.
right.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.